Dive into the Americas today with hosts Carl Meacham and Robert Funk for insights on U.S. Latin America relations and inter-American dynamics you won't find anywhere else. Welcome to Americas Today. I'm your host, Carl Meacham, president of Global Americans, and I'm joined by my VP, Robert Funk. Today we have a special guest. We have Ambassador John Feeley, who is executive director for the Center for Media Integrity of the Americas and former U.S. ambassador to Panama. I'm really excited to have the ambassador. John brings 28 years of diplomatic experience, having served as principal deputy assistant secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs and deputy executive secretary under Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. He is a political consultant for Spanish language media for Univision, and John has also appeared in leading English language media on U.S. relationships with Latin American governments. His deep insights into U.S. Latin American relations make him, I think, the ideal bridge to discuss recent events in the United States. So today we're going to talk about the subjects of the day. We're going to talk about the election. We're going to talk about the debates, the attempt on former President Trump's life, and his VP choice, Senator J.D. Vance. So I'm really excited about today. We're going to look at the implications that these developments have for Latin America. So how you doing, John? How are you?
I'm doing just fine. And thanks so much, Carl and Robert. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and all the folks who are listening into on Global Americans.
Awesome. So we're gonna start this in a different way. Obviously, lots of developments during the last week. I've had great conversations with my friend and colleague, Robert, trying to make sense of some of this. So what I'm going to do is start with Robert's sort of musings on the most, I guess, recent development, right? The attempted assassination of President Trump. And just get you to react to how he or what he makes of it. So, Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Carl. I mean, as Carl says, we've been talking so much about this and trying to make sense of it. And what's interesting is we come at it from really different perspectives and really different, ideological, geographic perspectives. And whereas I understand that the Americans are kind of in shock and looking at this and saying this is a pivotal event in the election in American history and so on, I sort of put this out there, and it's just something that I wonder, because if you look at everything that's happened, so much has happened in the last few years, and most of what's happened in the last few years has kind of just fallen by the way, just disappeared in the 24-hour news cycle, right? So, very few people still talk about Biden's performance generally, but they don't really talk about the debate anymore. They don't really talk about, January 6th seems like 1,000 years ago. So all these things that are really important events or just get kind of overtaken by new events. And now, you look at the media now, you look at news coverage now, and you see it's the convention. And you see, the war in Gaza has disappeared. It's the convention. So what I sort of have this discussion with Carl is, I said, I think this is going to disappear. I think the assassination attempt is obviously a terrible thing, and it doesn't bode well for the state of American politics. But I think 3 to 4 months down the line, I'm not so sure how relevant it's going to be in the grand scheme of things. So, and Carl was kind of pushing back and saying, no, this is absolutely a game changer. So I kind of put that out there to see, how you feel, particularly given your kind of your work also in media and things like that. How do you see that?
Well, I'll tell you, Robert, that is an excellent observation about the inundation that all Americans have these days as a result of digitalization and the explosion of social media, the 24/7 news cycle. And it bears restating. I mean, in a way, it's kind of obvious to state it, but it bears restating because we sort of live caught up in this. And it's almost as though you're caught in the riptide at the edge of the shore, and you want to get up there, but you keep getting pulled back in, and those small rollers keep crashing over you, and you don't have time to catch your breath. I wonder, however, if the three of us are perhaps over inundated to a greater extent than the average American. Most people that I know who don't live in the Acela corridor don't spend 6 to 7 hours a day on their iPhones. Most of those Americans, or if they're on their iPhones, it's doing DoorDash. It's, setting their schedule. And yeah, they go on and they get their news. We all know that, the three of us, right? We get up in the morning, and because we're all of a certain age and a certain demographic, we read 2 or 3 newspapers. We read aggregated, cultivated news headlines. And in that sense, I think you are right. The assassination attempt, which was just Saturday, and is a horrific thing. I mean, think of all of us as kids. We learned about the Lincoln assassination. It sticks in our head. If there's, one question most Americans, despite how poor our secondary education is, will recognize is, who was the American president who was assassinated? They may forget about, they may forget about the Reagan attempted assassination, but an assassination against a president is a fundamental game changer for the moment in which it's in. There are a lot of people who are out there saying, this is not us, right? And I heard the same thing around January 6th. This is not who we are. And my feeling has always been, no, sadly, this is part
I
of
agree.
who we
Yeah.
are. The American body politic has always, we were birthed in violence. I'm not condoning it at all. But what I am saying is that it is, I think, historically inaccurate to say that political violence has no place in American history. I'm sorry, political violence has a very prominent place in American history, but our task right now as an American people should be to minimize it and to render it such that violence has no place in our political future.
Yeah, because we've just gone cycle in and cycle out with it, and I'm fearful that we're just opening up this cycle again. I remember before my dad passed away in 2018, I asked him about what his opinions were of the Trump administration, and every at Charlottesville, all the things that had happened at the time, and he said to me, you haven't had any political violence. You haven't had any political assassinations. And I fear that we are entering a new phase again. And I even though I agree with what you're saying, John, that it shouldn't be part of this, I fear that we're entering a pretty dark chapter again. But let me move on a little bit here. I think, we can get stuck on these questions and just keep on going deeper and deeper. But before we were talking about the assassination attempt on the president, we were talking about the debates, and we were talking about President Biden's performance at the first presidential debate. That left me wondering a little bit, what do you think? Do you think that this issue is going to return? Do you think that there are any chances that they might do a change on the Democratic side? How do you think also, now that we're in the middle of the Republican National Convention, how do you think these developments and these questions play in Latin America, who's observing this?
Sure. I think the poor debate performance by Joe Biden just 2 weeks ago now, which seems like an eternity, as you said, is something that sadly is going to return. I believe, having watched my own father age, having watched other people age, that Joe Biden is not out of it. He's not what the Republicans, some of the horrible terms they use for him, oatmeal brain, sock puppet, I mean, this is terrible, sort of Lee Atwater inspired political vitriol in a knife fight. But I do think that the compassionate and objective, if I can use that term, view is that Joe Biden is somebody who is aging. And I think that the fellow who, and I forget the name right now, but the fellow who investigated him in the Hunter Biden laptop case got it about right. A very nice elderly gentleman with sometimes weak memory who forgets things. Okay, that is not a crime, that is not a moral failing, but it is something that is going to recur over and over. And so, sadly, in a presidential election such that we have now, where the scrutiny is white hot, 24/7, every day, every word is scrutinized, analyzed, and blasted around the world at the speed of a send button, Joe Biden will make more mistakes, and they will be capitalized upon by the Republican Party's media spin operation. What that means is that he will, as a result of that debate, he will constantly be reminded of it. And so I think that no matter what the issue of the day is, especially something as horrific and galvanizing and eyeball catching as a presidential assassination, the next time Joe Biden talks and muffs a word or refers to his vice president as President Trump or gets something backwards or says he should have never said the word put a bullseye on Donald Trump as he did yesterday with Lester Holt, you're going to see it come back up. What that means is I believe he is a critically wounded candidate. And my personal view is he should not be the candidate, but I am also cognizant of the practicalities of time. You've got just a couple of weeks before the August 15th Democratic convention in August. And I hear all of the people who are saying, hey, you don't change your horse in the middle of the stream. You got to ride it out through. Okay, if that's the case of the Brahmins in the Democratic Party, understand you're riding a three-legged mule to the race. And it's not going to change. He's not going to get to the other side of the River Jordan and be baptized anew with a younger, more flexible, more cognitive, more rapid fire voice and mind. He's going to still be an 81, 82-year-old man who is slowly and normally cognitively declining. That worries me because what I think that does is it makes Donald Trump much stronger. As far as the question, Carl, as to how does Latin America perceive us, remember that Latin America traditionally comes out of a history of the caudillo, the strongman, far more than the United States history. Latin America has, in many ways, always looked to a savior-like figure, to a Bolivar type figure, to think of how in the various countries you have, what are referred to as the próceres, right? The founding fathers. And these were mostly either peninsulares, people who were born in Spain and came to the New World, but more often than not, criollos. They were the Spanish or the American-born offspring of Spanish parents, peninsular parents. But these are people who are still venerated. They decorate their portraits, decorate presidential halls. So Latins naturally look to the strongman leader more than the United States. And in that regard, what they see is an incredibly, now visually anyway, strengthened Donald Trump with blood coming down his ear and a fist up in the air, and a weak and bumbling, stumbling Joe Biden.
That answer really plays into something that I was wondering. I've been wondering for a while. When you observe American politics over the last 10 years or so, and you look at everything from the recent assassination attempt to the rise of populism, the political polarization, a lot of people have talked about how American politics has become Latin Americanized. And to what degree do you think that's true, and why do you think that is? I mean, now even to the degree of that now we now have an actual caudillo, and people, the American electorate seems to be going for that in the same way that Latin Americans have gone for it. How do you think? Where does that come from?
I think it comes from the fact, Robert, that democracy is really hard. And democracy is the sort of thing that needs constant tending. And I think if you look back historically, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end nominally of East-West confrontation, there was, Francis Fukuyama published an article called The End of History, right? We all kind of snicker at that now. But I remember back during those years, there was this kind of sense that the West had won, liberal democracy had won. Communism had been defeated, and markets were, and Adam Smith had won the historical dialectic. And I think we kind of went into, we in the West, I'm not saying just the United States, I'm not saying just Republicans, just Democrats, but Western liberal democratic leaders kind of went into a bit of a democratic coma. They defunded programs over the next 15 to 20 years in the global South, certainly in Latin America, that had to do with working on how do you make a more perfect union? How do you build strong political parties? How do you allow for tolerance and inclusion? And how do you strengthen the rule of law? All the programs that I remember as a young Foreign Service officer, those things were gutted over my nearly 3 decades. And the only thing we could ever get money for was to fight drugs or to fight terrorism. So I would dress up programs for ballerinas from, backwater neighborhoods and call it an anti-global terror, inculcation program. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's really true. And I think it's because the short answer is I think it's because we took our eye off the ball that democracy really requires constant tending in the garden. And I think that's also true here in the United States.
No, that's exactly right. And let me just return a little bit. Again, this idea that this is new to the United States. This political violence is new. In the '60s, with King and the Kennedys being killed, which begs the question: what do you think the biggest misconceptions Americans have of Latin America, especially in the context of the election happening here in the US? We're starting to see papers by the different campaigns, right, on what the policies will be to the region. We know what Biden's policies have been up to now, and sort of the continuation of those policies, right? The root causes in Central America, some of the attempts at sort of harmonizing trade, right? APEP, right? And we have a little bit now of what's going to happen or what could happen with Trump, right? But his focus was a lot on Venezuela, right? What do you think the biggest misconceptions from the U.S. have been about Latin America?
I think, speaking for the American polity, for the American people, I think the biggest misconception is their characterization of Latin America as a place from which really uneducated, poor, underdeveloped, desperate refugees come and just want to get a piece of the American pie. That's the Trump stereotype, right? They're rapists, they're criminals, they're letting people out of their mental institutions. I mean, these are not my words. These are the former president's words. That conception, that misconception, sadly, is perpetuated across many areas where people don't have direct daily contact with Latins in the United States. Now, interestingly, and you guys both know this, and I know this, but I don't think a lot of Americans, certainly in the Acela corridor, know this. And when I say the Acela corridor, I mean the elite, coastal elites that, MAGA types love to rail against. When you go out into middle America, the South, heavily red states, you find plenty of Latins. And what you find is that those Latins, and it's a mistake always to refer to them as a monolithic voting bloc or a monolithic immigrant bloc, because an immigrant Argentine has nothing in common with an immigrant Central American, except the Spanish language. But other than that, they really are very different in their worldviews and their culture and their upbringing, many times in their socioeconomic standing. But where you see MAGA types, right? And let's just take, your central casting, caricatured Appalachia town hall. There's a Mexican store called La Michoacana that's in that neighborhood, and they're selling Tepoztlan ices. And the MAGA people go in and buy them and like them and generally try to talk to these people. And there is cohabitation, if you will, there is coexistence on a personal level. I can't tell you how many people I know who are MAGA supporters, Trump supporters, who buy the line about building the wall and yet have a gardener or have a housekeeper who they absolutely profess to love. And much in the way that Americans in the 1950s and 60s, who in the era of civil rights would say, some of my best friends are Black. I know plenty of MAGA Republicans who genuinely mean this. I'm not saying this to be snide. Yeah. They genuinely will say, oh no, Rosa and Heriberto, oh, they're the hardest working people I've ever seen. They came on Sunday and they were working here. And so again, there's this misconception that taken in the aggregate, Latins represent a threat to your piece of the pie. They're going to come, they're going to take your services, they're going to fill up your hospitals, their kids are going to get pregnant and they're going to be taking hospital beds from you. Those kids are going to get born here illegally, which is a dumb statement because no human being in and of himself or herself or themselves is illegal. So those illegal kids are going to sit in my public school seats and they're going to take away education from my kids. The whole MAGA concept is driven by fear that someone else, the other, is taking a piece of your pie. And I think that's a misconception that paradoxically is remedied when you break down relations between Americans and people from Latin America and the Americas on an individual basis. And for the most part, they seem to get along just fine, as most humans will.
John, you mentioned in passing in your last answer the sort of the central casting Appalachian MAGA type. And just this week, it was announced that one of those Appalachian MAGA types is
hillbilly, right?
is going to be a vice presidential candidate. His positions are well known and they're controversial. And for the most part, even though there hasn't been a huge emphasis on Latin America, what you can glean from his positions are that they are, he supports tariffs. He's not a free trader. He doesn't like immigration. He's an America firster. How do you think these will affect the U.S. relationship with Latin America should he and his running mate win in November? And especially not only trade, but also security issues, which is a huge thing in Colombia and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. J.D. Vance has been public in stating that he supports U.S. military attacks into Mexico to go after the cartels, which is just a colossally stupid idea. Yeah, look, the announcement of J.D. Vance, who shares something in common with me, we're both old Marines. We're both also 6-foot white males, so I think that probably puts us in a basket somewhere. I'm not sure if it's deplorable, but it puts us in a basket. The policy positions of J.D. Vance and his views on both domestic and international policy are well known because J.D. Vance is a Yale-educated lawyer. He is an exceptionally eloquent and good speaker, and he does not hold back on what his views are. But I think if you take a look at them, they do absolutely nothing to broaden the Trump ticket appeal. He is basically a mini-me of Donald Trump. He has been anti-NATO. He absolutely supported when the president said, I'm going to let Russia do whatever the hell it wants in Ukraine. He has supported Trump's calls from his first administration for U.S. military attacks into Mexico. Again, a colossally stupid idea. Our number one trading partner, and you're going to launch cruise missiles from a site in the United States to try to hit a trailer somewhere in the state of Durango or in Culiacan, killing untold numbers of civilians. Not a smart idea, but a jingoistic America First idea. J.D. Vance supports the great replacement theory, what we were just talking about. People from Latin America, from different cultures, the only common denominator is that they're south of the Rio Grande and they speak Spanish or Portuguese. They come to the United States, they renew our fabric, just as my ancestors from Italy and Ireland did 120 years ago, 130 years ago. He sees this as a tremendous threat, what I was talking about earlier, right? The great replacement theory. You're coming to take a piece of my white Christian pie and you're going to turn it into a tamale and put hot sauce on it. And I don't like that. He also, let's take a look at what he said, right? He's also a conspiracy theorist, and that is really scary. J.D. Vance has publicly stated that Biden has, or the Biden administration, but I think if I recall correctly, he said Biden himself has quietly allowed fentanyl to come into the United States so that it can poison and kill people who did not vote for him in his Appalachian holler. Holler being a small little riachuelo, a small area for our Latin American listeners. It's a very hillbilly word. So J.D. Vance he voted against the bipartisan immigration bill because it would have helped Biden politically, even though it would have strengthened and organized and provided more resources to our border. J.D. Vance is the kind of guy who says we could learn a lot from Viktor Orban in Hungary. Take a look at Viktor Orban, okay? He's pretty much a crusader from the medieval era. He doesn't like Muslims. He doesn't like anyone who's dark. He doesn't like anybody who's Christian. And he says, not Christian. And he says so publicly at CPAC. So J.D. Vance has pretty much already cast himself as Donald Trump's mini-me. And I have to wonder, as somebody who does not want to see Donald Trump come back, if this really helps the ticket. In a way, I was actually pretty happy. Because if you stop and you think about it, this entire election is going to fall down to 6 or 7 undecided states, and the undecided voters in those 6 or 7 states. And I think all of the people who would line up behind Donald Trump and J.D. Vance in this America First and Great Replacement Theory line, they're already counted. They're not among the undecided. They're on the MAGA bus, and they're going to vote, and there's going to be 68 to 72 million of them. But when we're talking about winning an electoral college race where states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Nevada and Arizona and Georgia are going to be decided by 20 to 25, maybe 30,000 votes, you're not talking about a vice presidential candidate in J.D. Vance who's going to bring a lot of new or unexpected converts to the Trump ticket.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, but I just give it a little bit of a different spin. I think he's doubling down on the white, lower middle class grouping or vote. I think that what you're saying is exactly right insofar as getting new voters. I don't think that this is a play to get new voters. I think this is a play to get out the vote from his base. And, this parallel or the contrast that you're going to see between the Trump-Vance ticket and if Biden stays on, Biden-Harris or whatever would come from that is going to be a cultural fight. This is no longer about policies. This is no longer about lower taxes, higher taxes, more government, less government. This is a cultural battle that we're seeing here in the United States. I wanted to, thank you for this wonderful session, and we tried to pack in as much as we could into this, and you have been as you are usually, but it's nice to be able to share in these moments with you. Gracious and comprehensive in your explanations and your willingness to answer our questions. But I can't let you leave here without also chatting a little bit
I'm
about
not going to
Panama.
call the race.
No, I'm not going to ask you to do that. But I do want you to talk to me a little bit about Panama. Panama had an election on May 5th, and they elected Jose Raul Mulino as their president, which I think is probably a difference as far as what he has promised or the way that he has promised and how he came to be. Right on the campaign trail, he vowed to put more money in Panamanians' pockets, build large infrastructure projects, and he said he would close the border. Obviously, the last point, closing the border, and a recent tweet, I think, that President Molino sent to candidate Trump after the assassination attempt did not go ignored. I just want to get your view. How do you see things developing between the two countries? How do you see things developing in Panama to deal or to address some of the issues that he promised he'd deal with in the campaign?
I'm actually pretty optimistic about Jose Raul Molino and his government. I'm very well aware that he came to be the president of Panama on the coattails of Ricardo Martinelli, somebody who truly was Trump before Trump. He's worth another whole show where we can talk about what a tropical caudillo serial kleptocrat is like, somebody who is a full-on narcissist with no moral compass, who actually looks and sounds.
So you liked them.
So Donald Trump, yeah, no, Martinelli and I never really crossed paths too much. He was hiding out in the United States, avoiding extradition while I was the ambassador. But yeah, not a guy that I think is terribly admirable, not a guy who should lead a society, but very popular among a certain segment. And Panama, because it has a first past the post, one round popular vote only, where presidents are routinely elected with less than 40% of the vote. Martinelli was leading. Martinelli gets disqualified because the long arm of the law finally caught up with him. And Molino was his vice presidential candidate for all of 3 months, takes over. He won with 34% of the vote. I think it's fair to say that Jose Raul Molino did not win one of those 34% of the Panamanian votes. They were wholesale translated votes from Martinelli, who promised to put a lot of money in people's pockets, literally promising direct transfers into their pockets. But he's out and Molino's in. Since he has come in, Jose Raul Molino, whom I do know, and it was a very good security minister under Martinelli when he was president in his first term. Jose Raul Molino has made some excellent choices. He has made some very, very temperate speeches, temperate in the sense that he has moved away from the populism of Martinelli's traditional speech. He has nominated an outstandingly technocratic cabinet. And while, Carl, as you mentioned, immigration in the Darien may be the issue that's top of mind for Americans looking at the bilateral relationship with Panama, the fact is that the issues that are top of mind for Panamanians have to do with the same bread and butter issues we have here in the United States. They are worried about a social security crisis. They are worried about a hydrology crisis and the rainfall and how they will be able to, in an era of global climate climate change, and there are no climate deniers in Panama because they can all go and watch the levels of the Panama Canal sink. Yeah. They have a whole set of issues that Molino has to deal with. Connectivity, both physical in terms of infrastructure and connectivity in terms of 5G and digital. Molino has taken on a very ambitious agenda, and quite frankly, I think he's done it in an exceptionally responsible way, moderating his dialogue. He signed an MOU to deal with that migration issue with Secretary Mayorkas on the day of his inauguration. And the basic component, the big thing in that is that the United States will begin to run deportation flights out of Panama and pay for them so that people don't make the useless and dangerous trip up through the Central American Isthmus to get into Mexico and sneak into the United States or claim asylum in the United States, as the vast majority are doing now. I think Molino has a really good chance of being an excellent transitional president in Panama. They do not have re-election, so he will only have the one term here. He can't be reelected right afterwards. He could be reelected as Martinelli was or tried to be a couple of terms later. But the big key for Martinelli is going to be, can he put distance between him and Martinelli?
Mm.
So far, he seems to be doing that. And personally, as somebody who cares about the U.S.-Panama relationship, I would encourage him to continue doing that. His team, as I said, is very technocratic. Felipe Chapman, Javier Acha, these are people who are very skilled. Jose Ramon Icasa, who's running the infrastructure and the canal ministries at the same time. These are folks who know what they're doing. And I think what they're going to have to do, what the Panamanians are going to have to do, like everyone else in the region is going to have to do, is sit back, keep their powder dry, wait for the United States to figure out what it does in November, and then adjust. If Donald Trump is reelected, I think the whole of the Americas is going to be in for treatment very similar to what we saw in his first term, which is pretty much not paying attention to them at all, not really giving them the time of day, unless you want something from them. And then he and his administration will come at them with a pretty relentless transactional agenda. The only exception to that is Mexico because of the border issue. But Panama, I think if it just hunkers down, it works on its own scary fiscal deficit that it has right now, if it works on getting a second reservoir to feed the canal, if it works on structurally fixing its Social Security, building connectivity, and trying to strengthen the rule of law, which has always been a major problem in Mexico in Panama, in terms of corruption. If it does that, I think Panama will emerge really strong and a leader in the region, regardless of whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump is elected.
Well, these are nuggets of gold from the former ambassador to Panama. So thank you for sharing that with us. Robert, I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to add, any pressing questions?
I have lots more questions, but I think that we'll save them for part B.
Excellent.
That means there's a promise you'll invite me back?
I think so.
I'm honored, boys.
I'm assuming we're going to get a lot of good feedback from friends.
Thank you, and thank you guys for what you do at Global America.
No,
Thanks
thank
very
you
much.
so much, and it's been wonderful. Thanks a lot. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Americas Today, our podcast for anyone and everyone interested in the Americas. We hope you enjoyed this episode and the unique insights we aim to deliver every week. For now, we're signing off and wishing you a great day.